Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much for joining us to a new AMEC Not For Profit talk. In today's talk, we're going to explore how to create visually enhanced and impactful reports, scorecards, and dashboards. I am Jose de Buerba. I head the business intelligence for communications at the World Bank. That is my real job. My passion work is to work with AMEC and organize these sessions and engage with the community in sharing best practices for communications M&E. I also co-chair AMEC's not-for-profit group together with my two amazing colleagues. I'm sure are in attendance today, Camille Remo from the OECD and Michelle Hawkins from NATO. So before I introduce Trisha today, the person you all have come to hear this morning or this afternoon, I really want to sincerely thank AMEC for giving nonprofits, the platform for organizing these knowledge sharing sessions. Particularly the wonderful Jonah Berg, the global managing director, and the amazing Julie Wilkinson, who makes everything possible within AMEC. She's two just amazing people. So thank you so much. So for those of you that are not familiar with AMEC, we are the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication, and AMEC is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. We are the largest media intelligence and insights professional body, well known for the Barcelona principles, integrated evaluation framework, and really setting global standards for what constitutes best M&E practice. Now, if you allow me to do one plug, is to please, if your non-for-profit organization is not yet a member of AMEC, consider joining. We really have something very special going on the group. We have around 30 organizations being members. We organize these knowledge sharing sessions. We have a base camp where we share some tools, tips. We have a chat. And don't tell Jonah, it's a bargain. So really do consider joining. If you don't know if your association or if your organization is a member, do reach out, ask me, because you can access all these goodies through your organizational membership. So, all right. So with that, a few housekeeping items that would be important for you to keep in mind. The first thing is the webinar will be recorded. It will be sent to all of you or to anybody that has registered to the session. We had 190 people registering to the session, which is amazing. And we expect around half of you to be watching live and the other half hopefully watching the recording. We will also share the PowerPoint and it will be all posted in the AMEC Not For Profit Basecamp. Now, also, please use the Q&A box for questions and comments. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box. Enter all the questions anytime through the session. I will read them to Trisha towards the end. And you can also use the chat if you want to comment on things that you see that are great, like, whoa, this is amazing, or any other comments. And if you put questions there, I'll keep an eye on that too, and we'll bring them up. If you have issues with your computer speakers, please try to join by phone option. I think there should be an option there somewhere. And after the session, very important, we're going to send you a survey. We measure everything. So please fill it in. We need to hear from you in order to improve any future sessions. All right. So that's, I think that's from me. So the moment has arrived. Let me introduce you to Trisha Pascale, who is there on the screen. You can see her. So Trisha is, let me pull on my slides. I'm sorry, Trisha, I'm doing a very bad job of introducing you. So Trisha is the Senior Vice President for Monitoring, Measurement and Analytics at Edelman Intelligence. She has a wealth of experience on data analysis, competitive intelligence, and measurement framework support. Experience in both the private sector, in the agency world, in nonprofits as well. And I actually met Trisha a few years ago at a measurement conference, of course, and I was really impressed with Trisha's presentation. And I invited her to come to the World Bank. I mean, she was actually one of the last persons I met in person outside the bank before the pandemic hit and we all went home. I think that was still in January 2020, if I remember correctly, Trisha. And so Trisha met with my team and I, and we were really impressed with her presentation. And Trisha made a strategic mistake, which is that she couldn't share her slides because she had a Mac. So she emailed me her slides. And Trisha, that was a mistake because we really dissected all the slides, all these goodies, all the scorecards that you had in your PowerPoint, and it has really served us as inspiration for a lot of the way we report actually at the World Bank. So when I heard from the community that one of the things they wanted to hear is how do we report better and create scorecards, I immediately thought of you, Trisha, and so thank you again for joining. And with that, let me just turn it over to you. Please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. And you can save me the introduction that I was of who I am. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will say I love measurement. You can call me an analytics nerd. I'm totally fine with it. But I really do find the idea of bringing all data sources together and making them tell a story really gets me excited, as you'll probably see as I talk through this. So really excited to talk to you all today and talk about some of our principles within measurement, how we're going to go through and try to enhance measurement and some different tips and tricks. And then because I personally find, as Jose mentioned, showing you some of the examples of things we've done can just serve as inspiration. And the good news is we're going to share the deck. So I hope you also see the same value, that you can dig through it and see what works for you. This is really an opportunity, I think, for us as a community to come together, learn from each other, and then hopefully this starts a lot of conversations about what each organization's doing so that we can kind of keep growing and building. So enough about me, more about measurement. I really like to think about measurement as sort of this intersection between we take data and transform them into insights. And historically, what we found is that measurement has really just been a reporting mechanism. It's really this transactional assessment of here's my data, here's the report. And really, a lot of times what we're seeing is that they're very single sourced. We're seeing people are reporting out on their earned media and then their social media and then their reputation and things like that. And that's just historically how we've all done reporting. When I entered the industry about 20 years ago, everybody was used to producing these big reports. But over time and, with advances and just the way the business world has looked, we've sort of seen this shift. And I think it's so important and it's so valuable to us as measurement professionals and communications and marketing individuals, is really that we need to transform reporting from or measurement from a reporting mechanism into more of like holistic evaluations. We want to think about this more about how we can use this data to not only assess what happened, but what is going to happen, what we're going to do with it. And I think a key way of doing that is really looking beyond an individual platform, looking beyond our organization or your group, and seeing how we can actually make this really results oriented. So we're looking at trends, we're looking at what we're noticing. And I think that's just so much more valuable to everyone. And then also the good news is that we all remember, I'm sure, those horrible reports that just get exported out of a tool from the early 2000s. The good news is the industry has really started to look at how do you do data visualization, which just helps people consume it and digest it. I think, we all have stakeholders, mostly senior, that say, I want a report. They don't want a 45 slide deck or an ugly, printout. They really actually want something that they can look at, review for 15 minutes, and then start peppering you with questions, which is really the fun part of all of our jobs. So to start off and just kind of set the premise is, again, remembering that I'm a bit of a data nerd, but I really do view that like data is a gift. It's something that's given to us. It's something that we can, it's not that we're just extracting it. It's something we can use. And so if we think of it as that way, we're going to also think of data as telling a story, uncovering unexpected outcomes, looking to understand what it means for our organization. And so if we think about data as sort of that fundamental gift we're given and what we do with it matters, I think we kind of get to that point of the more data, the better. We all like more guests, right? So, thinking about data as how we pull it all together and make something really great with it, and how we utilize that. Because we all know if we give a gift, we want it to, be used. So I'm gonna just do my quick build here. So, what we're saying when we think about measurement, I like to root it in the core tenets of measurement. And I think over time, as I've mentioned, these have evolved and people have started to think about measurement in a different light. And so one of the ways that we think about measurement is that we really want to leverage our insights to inform the future. We really want to look and see what's happening to figure out how we should use that data if we're just always looking at it as a retrospective, really all we're doing is grading ourselves. And so we want to make sure that what we're saying is, okay, this didn't work, but next time I should try this, or this really worked, we should apply it here. And those are the type of things we want to do. I think also we have so much data. All of our organizations have it. And so that's awesome and it's great, but sometimes it can be an overload. So it's important that when we think about the data, and you'll see this as we go through my deck, the desired business outcomes, what your organization wants to achieve, the audiences they're trying to reach and what they're trying to reach those audiences with should be reflective in what data we use. So we don't have to use everything. I always say it's great to track everything, big fan of tracking everything, but not necessarily because you're going to use and report on every piece. You just may need it for deeper analysis or one-off things. But when we're thinking about true measurement, we really want to be strategic and thoughtful about the measurement that we use. We also want to be holistic. So, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes, we think about things in the different channels or what communications does in marketing. We're an integrated organization. Everybody has the same goal to push forward, your organization's message or, increase donations or whatever the different elements that you're trying to push. And so thinking about it as one ecosystem and pulling metrics from all those different components, while it can sound overwhelming, it really isn't. And I think the value it brings is really, really beneficial. And then lastly, I think one thing we've all learned probably over the last few years, if nothing else, is the need to be flexible. Business has changed. Nonprofits have changed, everything has changed. And so we want to make sure that whatever we're building is the foundation that can continue to evolve with a company. And that even means, in terms of a lot of times when I'm talking to people and they say, but I only have control over this data. Start there and pull in more. As you start to build, you'll get more data. Other people will want to join and partner with you. But you have to start somewhere. So just building it with the idea that it's not going to be the same in 6 months, in 12 months, it may evolve, it may transform. And then the one last thing that I always like to say is measurement shouldn't be complex. So if we create this crazy algorithm that's like a black box that we throw all our metrics in and out pops a number, nobody's going to believe that number. So we really need to make sure that when we're doing it, it's easily explained to individuals that don't just do measurement. Everyone doesn't have to have the same analytics mind. I love working with creatives and all different people that maybe have different kind of mindsets, but they all have to be able to understand what to do with that data. So how do we do it? So I think the first part is really developing that measurement framework, and then what we're going to look like in how we actually, what are we producing? What's our outputs? So as we think about this, again, I'm not great with builds, so I'm going to just build it all out and then we'll talk about it together. Here we go. So, I like to think about building a measurement framework in kind of a cute way with some nice cartoons. But, the first thing we're going to want to do is review what your organization's doing. What's your, what are you currently reporting on? What's the cadence? Who's reviewing them? What tools do you have? And ultimately, that goal is to understand a little bit of what's working, a little bit of what's missing, and where you want to go. And you don't have to have that all mapped out on day one, but that's basically the premise. So usually I'll tell people, when we start out, we want to sit down and talk to people about what reports they're getting. If you're producing them, you probably already know that, but also talking to some key stakeholders to understand where are the reports helping them and where are they maybe, falling short, or is there a wish list of things that people would want? Not promising anything, but just offering up an opportunity to understand it. And then we want to understand, how would the future of reports look? So we're kind of auditing and assessing what our clients need. So this can be different audience groups. A lot of times when I'm talking to organizations, it's the executive director that wants a quick, one-page scorecard, very pithy, tell me what I need to know. That's all I have time for. But then there's other people that I'll work with, which will be, the head of communications or the head of marketing, and they want that full deck with all the details. So understanding the use cases will also help us figure out what reporting mechanisms actually will meet their needs. One thing that also we think about when we start to think about building this out is, in an ideal world, we'd all have access to every bit of data we've ever wanted. But the interesting thing is that's never the case. So, we want to take a look at what we're currently doing, what tools we have accessible to us, and really try to understand how we're going to evolve and grow from there. I'm a big fan of start with what you have, build from there. Trying to get it all in one place, trying to get everything perfect will kind of just keep you in this cycle. So the goal is really to look at what you have, start building, but keep in mind what you'd want to pull in once you start to gain the traction and people start to get excited and offer you more data. So you're going to take that inventory. Then the next piece, and I would say this is probably the most critical part, is you're now going to be looking at a spreadsheet that has potentially 50, 100 metrics on it. Please don't use them all. Be strategic, be thoughtful. So going back to our objective of what are we trying to do? What are we trying to report? What are our stakeholders doing? We're now going to map our KPIs to those objectives. So for an example, if I'm working with an organization and they say to me, my goal is to increase awareness so that people have a more favorable reputation, a favorable perception of our company. We want a better reputation of our organization. So I'm gonna say, okay, these are the metrics that are really gonna support awareness. We're gonna probably have a little bit more of the, are you hitting the outlets that your audience is reading? Are you getting favorable content in social channels? Is your followership growing? Are you gaining traction amongst your audience? Reputation-wise or perception, I'm now going to want to think more about, from a media standpoint, maybe things around messaging, spokesperson visibility, executive visibility, and then if they have it, maybe pull in some primary research around company perceptions, reputation, trust, things like that. So, you know, as you can see, there's sort of a play between those. And those are just probably two elements. But thinking about it, we want to kind of hone in on the top few metrics that matter. And then the fun part starts. This is where the analytics people get to pretend they're a little bit creative. We want to make the reports visual. When I first started my career, I probably would have laughed at myself if I ever said that. But the truth is that as we're sharing these amongst our stakeholders, as we're getting traction amongst our organization, if it's easy to read and quite frankly looks pretty, people will pay attention. I'm sure there's a psychology behind it that I don't fully know, but it is really important. And then lastly, it's important to socialize our measurement framework and gain feedback. One of the things, as someone who currently works at an agency but has been on both sides of it, nothing is worse than when you send your report to the black hole. Send it out and you wait, and then maybe you ping someone and say, hey, did you see that great report? Crickets. Right? We want to avoid that. So the goal is to really keep getting feedback so that we're making these reports useful, not just to ourselves, but to others. So I like to think when I'm thinking about creating a report is that really the data is supporting the reporting. The reporting is driving some insights, but the insights should be actionable. So as we think through how we're going to do this, we're really going to develop a framework that's based on sort of that flow. And so, you know, we're going to start by thinking of our objectives, as I've noted. We're going to think about, you know, what's the purpose of the report? What's the use cases? How do these map back to our business or organization's goals and objectives? Mapping those specific KPIs, as I talked about before. And then it's, how do I get the data? What tools do I have access to? What do I need? And who do I need to partner with? I do recognize that most organizations, everybody doesn't have access to everything. So it does involve some partnership and collaboration with some of your colleagues in other areas that might be able to supply them. But that's part of the socialization process of talking about holistic measurement and getting people on board. I will say, once people start to see the outputs, they get excited. I can't tell you the number of times I'm working with a comms function and they say, if I could get the stuff from marketing, and I say, let's start building it and let's start socializing it. And then when the leaders of the organization say, hey, comms pulled this together, all of a sudden their colleague wants in. So there's ways to kind of help bring people together and do these reports in partnership. And the key really is that you're building them together. The insights should be integrated. And it's an opportunity for both of you to kind of come together to tell the story. And then the output, how do we make this look and feel like a really comprehensive report? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So this has a lot of words, and I'm glad we're sharing the deck because the way I like to think of this is building out based on the objectives, the KPIs, the toolkit, and the output. What I did is I tried to map out different things. Think of this as kind of like a choose your own adventure, if you will. So based on the different outputs, you can kind of highlight the elements that fit you, and it'll just kind of help serve as a little bit of a framework, I hope, that you can kind of start to think about what some metrics are, what some tools are, you know, what you would want to do. And it'll help drive sort of the you're giving me a lot of information, Trisha, but what do I do with it? This is hopefully kind of that worksheet that will help you kind of build. And just to touch on a few key things that I think is kind of interesting, or how I like to think of things, is when we think about KPIs, I often like to think of things both from a platform and channel perspective, but also what we call quantity and quality metrics. So thinking of things of not just the mentions and reach and impression-based metrics, we know the pitfalls of some of those. It doesn't make them any less relevant, but it does help to have some of them, and then also having some quality. So, not just I had the biggest share of voice, but also I had an increase in sentiment, or the depth of mention was really strong. So really my message is getting through. It's also important to kind of think through, what are your data requirements? What do you need? And again, some of this you might highlight, this is what I have today, pick a different color and highlight, this is what I want for tomorrow. But it just kind of helps you with some of the planning. And then the last piece with the output, which is really why we're here today and what we're driving towards, I think it's really important that whatever our output is, it generates context and insight. So when we think about it, the way we can do that is to offer things such as comparing yourself to a benchmark, or a certain historical score, or a trend, being able to say it increased and this is why. That's so important, because otherwise I can't tell you the number of times I've pulled a number together and I'm looking at it and I'm like, 53. 53, is that good? Is that bad? But once I start to say, oh, actually you were trending at a 43 for the last 4 months, and you increased because your executive did this amazing job at a conference and it got tons of media attention, or you did a paid promotion and that drove this, that's the type of stuff that helps us then figure out, what do we do next? And it really drives more of those strategic actions. So organizing the data to tell a story. So I think one thing that's important, and talking with a lot of my AMEC colleagues, is that people like to think of measurement as this big endeavor that we're all going to take on. And it does work, I'm not going to lie to you, but the good news is it doesn't have to be insanely expensive. It doesn't have to be something where you're, hiring a giant agency to come in and overhaul your measurement. I like to think of it as a phased approach. And the way I like to think of it is that, we have our content. What is the things we're trying to evaluate? What are our metrics that we're going to use to do that? How are we driving impact? How are we putting forward those insights? And then it's really about a design and a layout that works for your organization. But all of that stuff, and all the stuff I'm going to show you today, was not designed by some crazy tool. I will be perfectly honest as we get into it. All of the underpinnings are PowerPoint. And I purposely selected that for this group because I don't want everyone to feel like they have to go out and get their Tableau license and, invest in 18 different tools. If you have that, that's great. And you should definitely use it. Huge fan of that. But I also think that, you can start anywhere, and you can start with the tools you have today. And really it's about making sure that the data we're using has purpose, that the way we're presenting the data makes sense and drives people to use it, and that we're putting in the context and the insights. So as we're thinking about this, we're really going to drive towards the learning. And the learning really is how are you performing versus goal, and why? How do you fit within your peer set? What are the trends you're seeing, whether it be compared to your peers, or just trends that are changing in the nonprofit world, things like that. And then you can always put things like impact score. We can design a score, right, that uses all the metrics you have, that'll help track over time, that can kind of give you that one number. I will note that in a lot of the work that we do, we love our data and we love doing all of these things. Very often what we hear back from people is great, but my leader wants one number that says how I'm doing. And so what we can do is we can kind of build these reports, but we can also use that and make a composite metric that'll really help us with giving kind of each stakeholder what they need. So I can give my executive their composite score, how it's doing versus the last quarter, and the insights as to what's driving it. And then the rest of the team can look at more of the deeper meaning and the drivers behind it. So hopefully that's helpful in just kind of thinking through, how we could possibly do that. So now, hoping to get into some more of the fun and inspirational, and as I mentioned earlier, I hope you're looking at these for cool ideas, things that you want to do in your organization, ways that you could kind of think through this. And so when I think about reporting, I think about it in two kind of veins, right? So we have ongoing reporting, which can can be kind of a holistic different group of things. It can change over time. But one thing with ongoing reporting is a lot of our monitoring reports. We all do it. We all want to know how our organization is trending within the media. We all want to understand who's talking about us on social. And I'm a big fan of it. I think that the way we organize those are important. I think giving context, putting an executive summary is key. I also think if there are any metrics that we can share that would be helpful to contextualize what we're seeing is also great. And I also think how we organize that data can always be helpful, because then we're also showing it in a way that's digestible. We also can do monthlies and quarterlies, which typically can be anything from like a snapshot report. And we'll get into a couple more of these because I think this is where the team will probably get the most excited, but where it's kind of pulling in metrics from all over the organization and we're tracking that on a consistent basis. And then also campaign reports, so we can dig in. I think the key here, and when you look at some of the visuals, is really how to present the data in a way that it's not all text and it's not all charts. We want to strike that balance where there's some level of an insight, there's something that's really driving home the point, but we're also showing the data in a way that someone can say, oh, that makes sense. We also know that there's ad hoc needs, so we can always adapt them. You can see that sort of the issues and crisis type of reporting probably is very similar to what your monitoring reports may look like, just adapting them a little bit, throwing some sentiment charts in, things like that, that'll just kind of help, go into a little more detail into that specific issue. I think also when we think about it from, one-off topic analysis, from working with some of my not-for-profit partners, very often we'll have people come to us and say, hey, what is the conversation happening around large donations, or what are other executive leaders doing in my space, things like that. So you might want to do those. And I think using different ways to display the data is really helpful. So, you'll see something like a cluster analysis, and then, something more like pulling together some desk research on some academic studies and pulling out the content, but just positioning it in a way where it's one slide that just tells you what you need to know. And then also you all make some really great announcements. Many of your organizations are just doing phenomenal things for the world. And so being able to report out on that in a way that's easily digestible and able to kind of pull out the how did we do? What was our impact? What did we drive? So, those are kind of the high level types of reporting, but I know everybody loves a good scorecard. I think that's something that the industry is moving to and people are doing. So full disclosure, this was not actually for Disney. We did this as a kind of fun project internally. So not sharing anyone's secret sauce here. And all of this data is obviously not real. But what we were able to do is kind of pull together sort of a fun little playful scorecard here, where we were able to pull in things like conversions and then earned media, social media, and broadcast. So you can see like the whole point of this is a small executive summary around some fun launch that they, may or may not do. And then pulling in everything from broadcast coverage to key topics or posts on social. Then we also want to pull in some of the quality metrics, like what was the messaging? How often are people doing things? And then, made up sort of bookings and cost per bookings, just to kind of showcase what was interesting is how, how we could look at an event and really tie it to the business impact, but also focus on the comms. Additionally, looking at maybe, another company, we were working with one organization and they were a healthcare company. They were very interested in understanding how their reputation was doing. So we were running some reputation work with them. So we just pulled in that data. Again, totally separate work stream for measurement, but we had it accessible. So we grabbed it and said, how are they doing? What's the breakout of that? And gave them some scores so that they could track them. And you'll notice there's a lot of up and down arrows. That's intentional because we really wanted to be able to show what was increasing and decreasing. But then we also wanted to overlay that with traditional earned media like share of voice, content performance, what channels are doing well. And then in this case, also, they were doing a lot of employees comms. So we wanted to pull in how they were doing there because, we have the external comms and the internal comms and pulling it together. So I think this is just a nice way of kind of showing how you can look at things in different ways and pull it together. It's just a front and a back of a scorecard, but it's across different channels, different platforms, different audiences. But in a way, these all work together because, to be perfectly honest, your reputation and your earned media do have a correlation and connection. We also do, some campaign reporting, and this was one, we were working for a company that that was kind of an organization that sells consumer products, and they really wanted to understand how their campaigns are doing. They run 2 to 3 campaigns a quarter, and they really wanted to understand how they were doing. So this one, instead of focusing things on platforms, we actually focused it on performance of campaigns, performance of earned media, specific content creators, which is basically influencers. If you have partnerships with individuals that post content about your organization, we wanted to assess that and see which channels worked better. And then also what they were pushing out through their own newsroom. So, they had a very robust newsroom that was producing content, that was sharing things. So we wanted to be able to showcase that and see which types of content was doing well and which channels were working better for them. Is it better if you have a video to put it on LinkedIn or Instagram versus putting it on your blog? So these kind of were good ways to sort of break that out and look at them in a unique way. Also, we did another one for an e-commerce company, and this was one of my favorites because it just was very cute and a little quirky. But what I thought was interesting about this and why I wanted to share is that this is an example of, having a lot of data and the company really wanting to display as much of it as possible. You'll notice in some of the other ones, we really shrunk it down to say, give us your 2 to 3 metrics at work. Here, we actually had to show a lot more metrics, which we were able to do. But on the flip side, which I actually thought was kind of a cool idea, is we did sort of a star rating for them. Think of it as like a Yelp review, if you will. But essentially what we wanted to do is, because there were so many metrics, and as I was talking about with an impact score, we wanted to consolidate it so overall they could track things over time and understand the dynamics. So it was really neat. So we have an overall impact score, and then we have, you can see individual impact scores for each of their sections. And this included everything from earned and social to some employee comms to their website traffic, organic and paid. So it has a large variety of elements. And essentially we were able to develop this metric. We just, the underpinnings of that is an Excel spreadsheet and a lot of formulas, but nothing that anyone can't tackle on this call. But we were able to basically do that and understand what was driving performance. So effectively, when we look at this, the overall score was 3.8, but what was driving it up, let's say, was really their employee communications. They were doing great on engaging employees, but what was pulling it down was maybe some of their paid campaigns. So the action item there was, let's look into your paid campaigns and see, are our channels right? Are our audiences right? Things like that. So it's kind of a neat way to show a lot of metrics, but also boil it down so that everybody doesn't have to look at everything. And I will note on this one, there were a lot of stakeholders. So when a lot of stakeholders own one report, you end up with a lot of metrics. So that's kind of, I'm sure somebody on this team has that issue on their hands. So I hope that a lot of those offered everyone a little bit of insight, maybe a little bit of creative inspiration. And obviously I enjoy doing this stuff. I think this stuff is really fun. I'm always open to talk or brainstorm. But the goal was really to show you just different ways of doing things. So, as you're thinking about jumping in and starting your measurement journey or continuing your measurement journey, depending on where you fall, I think it's important to kind of give, just as I did with like the worksheet, maybe a couple checklist items. And I know I do this when I'm making a measurement framework, or if I'm building a scorecard, or if I'm building a report. I'll kind of remind myself, like, does it do these things? And if it doesn't, is it supposed to? So just a helpful kind of guidance, right? And so I think the big thing is making sure it's comprehensive, so it's pulling in everything you need. Or you have placeholders for the things you don't have access to. And then it's useful, it's practical, it's actually generating the insights you need. Speaking of insights, is it informative? Are people actually able to get the data out of it, or the value out of the data that really helps inform decisions, that helps with strategic recommendations? And if not, thinking about what we could do to make it that way. Easy for people to read, easy for people to engage with, and really easy to share. It's one reason I do love a good PowerPoint slide that we can make a PDF and everyone thinks it's fantastic, but it doesn't require logins and access and trainings. It's really simple. And I think that's kind of the key. We want people to have a low barrier to enter to actually engage with our reporting. Are we meeting our audience and our business's needs? Is your organization going to be able to use it for what they need it for. Also, is it scalable? Is it able to be used by multiple stakeholders? Are we able to showcase, the true impact of what we do? And I think it's really important that as we scale it, it's also consistent. So when we use the term mentions, we always mean the same thing. If we're using the term engagement, what does that mean? So it just helps for understanding and assessing the data, and everybody's using the same nomenclature. Additionally, is it replicable and flexible? So nothing is worse than when you build the coolest spreadsheet or the coolest scorecard or the coolest report, and it's a one-time use only. We all know how busy you are. So making things that are something that you can use monthly and quarterly, and it starts to get into a habit where you're able to update the data pretty quickly. You have the template, you have the format, and you get to spend the time really on the insights and the interesting part of it. Also, is it relevant? We really want to make sure we're reporting in a way that we can get these out rather quickly, because if somebody has to wait a month to learn what they did last month, by the time they learned what happened, another month has passed them by. So, thinking about how we get access to the data, and then on top of how we get access to the data, how we're using it and reporting it so that it feels really relevant to today, and it's not just a retrospective from, months and months ago. So I think that's really important. And then also, is it robust enough? Is it really telling you enough that you can do something? If every report you're delivering is saying, here are some insights, but now go look into these 6 things, it's time to start figuring out how to bring those 6 things into the report to be able to actually deliver on an insight and a strategic recommendation. So I'm going to leave you with an idea. I will fully admit I'm a runner, so I'm using a really bad phrase, but I do kind of like it, that it's not a sprint or a marathon. It's really a journey. I like to think of it, it's like an ultra marathon for those of you who like to run and are impressive enough to do that, which I am not. But it's really important that we think about it as you can be anywhere on this journey and you can move along. So one thing, if you hear one thing from me today, it's don't feel like you need to have everything figured out and everything done to start it. So it can start with just consistent measurement reports, looking at goals and benchmarking, doing some quick, here's 2 slides, here's 1 slide on our performance, and we're going to push this out every month or every quarter. It can be really that simple to start. Then you might move into, okay, we have that down, that's helpful, but now we really want to pull in some more insights, and the way to do that is to look at more trends. So now we want to add a quarterly report or a biannual report where we're looking at what are we seeing over time and where do we need to get to. You may want to pull in peers at this point if you haven't already. What are other organizations doing? Where do they fall in the spectrum? Those type of things, which is helpful. Then maybe we're going to break a little bit of a sweat, so we're going to jump into a light jog. And this is where we're going to start to look at more of the impact, so associating it back. So this is where we're really trying to understand what's the movement, how did we shift the scales, those type of things. And that's going to be kind of just your next build on your reporting. And then I think, the ultimate goal, the North Star, if you will, is, some of you may be already doing this, some it may be off in the distance, but, things like attribution modeling, things like, we call it CM cubed for market mix modeling for communications. But, you can do all sorts of different ways where you take all the data that you've found and that you've developed under the other factions of this, and you can start doing really cool modeling stuff. That actually can give you an ROI that can, give you exactly that answer of what was my impact to my organization. And the key to that is while that sounds intense, when you're doing these other components, you're actually building all of the pipes, if you will, or getting all the data sources organized and ready, so that when you're ready to make that leap to doing something like that, if and when you are, you actually have the baseline, you have the framework, and it's really about, getting more of the statistical modeling built out. But it's all built on the data that you've been building the whole time. So I think that, the good thing is that everybody can do this. Everybody can do it at the speed they want. And really, it's just about organizing and assessing and curating the data, and then building out a way to present it in a way that's insightful. So thank you so much for your time. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of them.
Wow. Thank you so much, Trisha. I mean, this is amazing. This is a presentation that I'm going to go back and look again because it was so much rich in terms of information. We have a few questions, but maybe I can take, the mic. I have the prerogative of being the moderator to mention a couple of things. First of all, I love the ending. I mean, one of my favorite movies with my kids is Ratatouille, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's like everyone can cook, so the Chef Cousteau approach. Everyone can do this, so I really like that. So one of the things, maybe two quick things, maybe that you can comment on. One, I really like how you didn't get hooked on the measuring outcomes and measuring outputs, and the KPIs are for outputs and the outcomes. And sometimes in my world, we get a little bit hooked with that, and we started to dismiss, oh no, this is an output, but we really want to measure the outcome, and we need then a survey, and we need to know how the stakeholders think and all that. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, really the value of output sometimes to really inform, communications. And I, obviously love the learning, emphasis that you're making on measurement. And then the other thing is on how you present this, how in our nonprofit worlds, we have our own internal clients, if you want, our communication colleagues with whom we work, and we need to build trust-based relationships from the beginning and understanding what they're trying to achieve. Sometimes not easy to then for them to really see the value of what we bring in, and not to perceive us as evaluators. Nobody wants to be really evaluated, So tell us a little bit some tips and tricks there to build those trust-based relationships. So those two things. I will have many questions coming in. We can jump into the next ones.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think when it comes to outcomes and outputs, I think that historically that's still a good framework and model, but I think you hit on it. It's, not getting so tied to designating outputs and outcomes and thinking more about strategic objectives. So like if we focus everything on what is the organization's strategic objectives, what is my group's maybe communications objectives, and we map those KPIs to that, you'll still be looking at outcomes and outputs, but without having to remove that categorization, you actually get to a place where measurement becomes a little bit easier. And there is a subjective nature to outcomes and outputs. And so this kind of removes that by saying, that's cool, you think it's an outcome, I think it's an output, but at the end of the day, it's an important metric, right? So let's get it in there and let's think about it that way. So I think, I think data people and people like us tend to want to do that because we like the organizational structure, but sometimes that kind of inhibits us from moving forward. So I don't say abandon it. It's just a different approach that maybe gets people a little bit more on the same page quicker. And usually it's a lot easier to get people, and I say usually, to align on the objective. And so then it's really just a question of, does this measure the objective? So hopefully that answered the question on outcomes and outputs. I will say in terms of internal stakeholders, and I have felt that on many occasions, whether it's on the client side or on the agency side, of how do you get people aligned? How do you get your stakeholders to jump on board with this? I will tell you that getting them involved early is really the key. So as you're starting to think about this, typically having a meeting and having them involved in that audit and assess process gets people hooked, because I think then they feel they're a part of it, which they are, their voice is heard. And none of us are teachers, right? None of us wanted to grade papers for a living. So we want to make sure that, we're presenting it as a way of, listen, we're not evaluating your performance. We're trying to give you data so that you can make actionable and strategic decisions. So let's sit down and talk about what you're getting today and what you need. And let's talk about how we can get and focus on that. How do I get you the data you need? And then doing it. I will say that very often I've had some clients who love the impact score, love sort of the grading. Full disclosure, I have one client that actually did an A, B, C, D, like we were in high school kind of grading system, and that worked for them. I will say if you're being perceived as more of a evaluator, maybe slowly move into more of that impact score grading, because it does feel a little bit like you're evaluating, and focus more on the metrics and the insights. But ultimately, I think what's really great is that the individuals and your stakeholders should be a part of the process and constantly giving input, so that they are feeling like they are actually, in many ways, my stakeholders are, those individuals who would be evaluated are the ones presenting it to their stakeholders. So kind of bringing it together, so you're not presenting how they're doing, you're presenting it together, I think will be key, and then feeling a vested interest in that.
That's great. All right, so a few more questions coming in. Let me read a couple, and we have more, but maybe we can take the first two. So the first one comes from Michelle at NATO. She's asking, do you have an in-house team of graphic designers to design reports? If so, how many? And if you can just bring into our reality, if we need how much can we outsource this? How much can we do in-house? And then the other thing that was, I think, on the chat, there was a specific questions about how did you get the rating for the Fortune 500 scorecard, the Yelp rating? Thank you. But let's take
Yep.
those two.
Sure. So from a design perspective, it's really up to you and what you have. I will be honest, I have an individual on my team who loves design. It's a passion of his. He's an artist on the side. And over the years, we've kind of talked about data visualization, and he makes this. So we don't actually use a designer for any of this. It just happens to be the skill set that falls on my team. I have worked with plenty of companies that have used designers. The one kind of watch out that I will say is that back to the easily updated and flexible, make sure your data people are a part of that process if you're using a designer, because designers make the most gorgeous scorecards, and I love them. And then I realize I can't update my charts without going back into their tool. So don't make that mistake. If you're doing it with a designer, they'll have the right eye, but just make sure that they're understanding that your team is going to be updating it. And so it needs to kind of work with the data, not necessarily just the design, but definitely doable in-house if you have the team and if you want to do it. I will say also there are partners that will design the scorecard and deliver that to you. So that's an option too, is that just because we create a lot of scorecards and we work with our partners constantly to update them, we also have partners where we design the scorecard and it's in a PowerPoint and we deliver it to them. So if you don't have it internally, you could look for partners, whether it be a design firm or a data firm that says, hey, I can make you the scorecard, I can teach you how to fish, and then you can do it. It's kind of up to you, and what you have. But I will say, I personally find making them really fun. So if you have someone in your organization that just has a creative bone in their body and wants to try it, it's not going to be, it's not as hard as it looks. And it's really just a lot of like overlaying colors and having some fun with the design. It could be a fun project for somebody who maybe has never thought of themselves as a data visualization person. And then your second question.
Sorry, Trisha, before you go to the next question, I have to jump on that because I really like when you at the presentation just said that, this is when data people try to think that we are creative. And it's true, I love doing it as well. And it's a lot of fun. In our case, at the World Bank, if it's useful, we work with an external designer and we have found a really good one that doesn't have an ego. And that's really important because designers tend to have a big ego and you say, no, change this. So what are you talking about? This is really important. No, hold on a moment. So the way we do them, she's designing them in PowerPoints and credit to you, Trisha. I think this is one of the outtakes that we took from after meeting with you. And it's fairly easy for us to update them, embedding the charts and why not. One of the things that we found, interesting was the fonts. Sometimes, she uses a font that we have to download into our computer. It's okay, it's not that bad. But in our case at the World Bank, we're working more and more with designers to come up with PowerPoint templates that we can replicate and that every single item can be updated. But we can give it a brand for a campaign, or we can give it a brand at the background for whatever we're measuring for the organization.
That's awesome. I do agree. Fonts can be fun, especially, on the agency side, the amount of decks I have to say, oh, and don't forget to download our fonts. It's one of my new favorite phrases. Awesome. And then just to touch on the rating. So the way we've done ratings is a customized composite score. So we'll look at a handful of metrics that we will align in our case with the client. So you might want to do that with your stakeholders. So we'll come up with, these are the 5 to 7 metrics that we want to input into the composite score. Sometimes we categorize them, just different ways to do it. And then we come up with bandwidth, bands of how they're performing and give them a rating scale. So it can be everything from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, depending on the need and the variation, and then looking at historical data usually to kind of look at how sort of the distribution comes out when we actually look at it. And some of it, I will say, it's a bit of an art and a bit of a science. So we like to use the history of it. We like to look at that to kind of set these benchmarks and delineate what constitutes a 1 and what constitutes a 5. But then I will say the other thing that's important is then we kind of sit down with our stakeholders and say, does this feel right? Does this work with what the strategy is? Because we don't want to just base it on history and then set ourselves up to either have a really easy, if we're getting a 5 every time, there's a problem. If we're getting a 1 every time, there's a problem. So, trying to understand, what the modifications have to be. And then I will say, once we have that kind of built out, we'll usually run it a few times to just gut check it, make sure it works, make sure everything's kind of coming out the way we would expect, and we're not being too easy or too hard on ourselves, that the measurement feels right. And then we'll employ it. I also will say a lot of clients that I work with want to update it. I would say I wouldn't update it any more than biannually or annually, unless you have a very changing organization, a big merger or something like that that we have to constitute for. But otherwise, I would say, keeping them pretty consistent, especially for like a fiscal year or an annual year, will just help give you that tracking and trending so that you can kind of see how it flows over time.
All right, that's great. So a couple of other questions we have here. So the first one, I think that's a really good one. Do you send surveys to the recipients of your reports to find out if the reports are meeting their needs and contain the criteria which are essential to them? And, you can expand if it's not surveys. I think you touched on, how do you evaluate your evaluations in a way, or your reports? And then the other one, taking another one, is can you show or talk through a practical example of using predictive analytics? Thank you.
Sure. So it's funny, we have sent surveys on behalf of our clients. I will say the response rate is typically low. I don't know if people are just like, oh, I got too many surveys. I don't know what it is, but we do typically, we don't typically get a ton of response. And I think the other piece to the survey is really going to be that open-ended component to it. So I personally find, especially if we only have 3, 4, 5 stakeholders, getting them in a room or virtual room and just talking through it and saying what works for you. And kind of, I will say what works great for me is I will be very honest and say, when we're creating this report, this section doesn't feel like it's adding a ton of value to me. What do you guys think? And getting them to say, oh, she's pointing a hole in the report. Now I'll kind of join in. So I'll really try to start, and it doesn't have to be negative. Maybe I'll start with a positive, but getting people started and saying, listen, the reports don't have to stay the same. So what value? But I do think that you can send a survey, and if you're an organization where people tend to be responsive, great. I just would really recommend having a section where people can write in things, because that's where you're going to get the meat of what you want to change. But I will say the conversation is probably the most helpful. And especially if you kind of can say to people, just tell me your honest opinion. It's kind of like you said with the designer, maybe don't have the designer in the room. So that way, if they say, I hate the picture that's behind this, you're not offending them. And we can soften that language. But I think that it's really helpful to kind of get that feedback in person and workshop it together. And that kind of goes back to your evaluation question. It's that constant feedback, but it's also offering them an opportunity to be invested in the next iteration. And then the predictive, yes, we have some really cool examples of the predictive work. One of the clients I work with is a large e-commerce and logistics coordinator, and we've done some really awesome work with them on taking everything from their reputation data, their earned data, their paid data, their social data, I mean, you name it, and it's all kind of been pulled together. And we've been able to model out sort of what's working where. And they also are a client that has a newsroom. So they're pumping out content about innovation or sustainability or, all these different things that they do, just absolutely amazing things. So kind of getting into some of that ESG work and things like that. And we were able to actually look at it, and by segmenting the data and looking at the modeling, we were able to not only tell them like Instagram works better for these types of stories. You want to focus more on your blog for these types of stories. This is helping, so we were able to actually show them both from like an engagement perspective, but also what's working to kind of shift perceptions of the company. But then we also are able to do it, which is kind of neat, on a beat perspective. So the different beats of what messaging they're trying to push out. we were able to actually assess that and say, like, these messages are really resonating and these are not. So you either need to figure out a different messaging strategy and things like that. And it's all based on data, which is just super cool. I will also say there's some predictive analytics, not to plug anything, but if you go to our website, our predictive analytics team has posted some really cool case studies that are free on there. So you can just grab them, just serving as inspiration. So always reach out to me. I can probably track down the case study and get it to you if you don't want to do it. But some of the predictive analytics stuff, I will say, I don't do it myself, but it is so interesting and so cool, and just understanding audiences, I think, like we've never done before. So not my world, but I love it.
All right, that's great. So I'm checking if there is any other questions. We have time for maybe one more question. If anybody has any question, please write it in the chat on the Q&A. Otherwise, what I would like to, the recording will be shared via email, iTunes. So if you're registered, you will get an email with the recording. So look out for that. And you're like me, you're probably dying to watch it again. I wanted to close also asking, where do we start? But I think your last slide said it, the crawl, walk, jog, run. Love the analogy. And I know you're a big marathon runner, Trisha. So maybe just one thing, maybe it's a bit nerdy, but we still use a lot of Excel. I mean, we have all these amazing tools. We go Adobe Analytics. Well, let's start mentioning too many brands. But then, all the data gets into the Excel. Before then, it goes into the scorecard. And that's when we do the selectivity. That's when we do the trend and so forth. Is that what you guys do as well? Or how do you recommend, managing these large amounts of data? You mentioned you capture a lot of data and then being selective. What is your command center for having all the data before you go into selectivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it does span. I think Excel, nothing's ever going to replace Excel in my heart. It's easy to use. It's accessible to all. As long as it's organized and updated accordingly, and always save a backup. Excel is great. I will say that, especially for clients with lots of data, we do typically try to use other tools that help with like database management. So more building a database. So, pulling it into whether it's like, a typical database, or even getting it loaded into something like Looker or Tableau or something like that. The benefit of that, I recognize that's not accessible to everybody, but the benefit of that is that if you actually wanted to take one of these scorecards and make it more real time, you've actually just done all the hard work. So that's one nice thing, that Excel is never going to be real time. But if one of the things we've done with different clients, and whether it be getting the API from TalkWalker or BrandWatch or something like that, and plugging it into the back end and feeding in, your search data and feeding in all those different things, is now it's all just kind of automatically going. And if you wanted to, you could have a real-time dashboard. I will say that's the luxury end of measurement. It's not necessary for everybody. And I will say, if you start with an Excel file and you note what the sources are, you basically have the foundation. And then if you ever wanted to move to that, you could. I would say it just kind of depends on the appetite, and it also depends on the volume of data. And if you really want more of that real-time nature versus I check every month, I check every quarter, it takes us an hour to update the Excel spreadsheet, we're good, then the other feels more robust. But if you are an organization that just has volumes upon volumes of data, the database may be an easier, once it's set up, an easier way to navigate.
And I was going to go there, because that means working with IT, and
Yes.
we are, and that's a separate session. How to talk to your clients for measurement, then how you talk to IT to tell them, explain, okay, this is actually what I need. We are very fortunate at the World Bank. I have to say, we have a wonderful, amazing IT team that understands very well our business needs and is very responsive. But that's for another time. Look, we are on time. Thank you so much, Trisha. I think this was so inspiring. And so again, thanks everyone for joining. You will get a link to the session recording, the slides, and the evaluation. Please do answer our survey. So with that, we're going to leave it there. Have a wonderful day.
Have a wonderful day all. Bye.